Our speaker today is Neal Pease. He is first and foremost a KU alum, a professor of history currently at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, specializes in the history of Poland and East Central Europe, particularly the role of the Catholic Church in the 20th century. He's editor-in-chief of the Polish Review, past president, current officer of the Polish-American Historical Association. His most recent book, Rome's the Most Faithful Daughter, The Catholic Church in Independent Poland, was named co-winner of the AC's Kowalski Prize for the best book in the field of Polish studies, as well as given a prize by the American Catholic Historical Association for the best book in the field of Catholic history. So we're very pleased to have him back. If you missed the Bacchus lecture yesterday, you missed an engaging, just terrific lecture. So,
thank you, Bart. Thank you all for coming to lunch today, and I hope I can make the time pass. I started out here, as a matter of, I don't want to say when I got my degrees, but I studied with Anna Chenchawa, here, Professor Emerita here, and been in Milwaukee, doing primarily 20th century Polish history. When I started doing research, it became clear to me that I needed to wait until the invention of the typewriter, if I was going to make any sense of the sources. So actually what I'm going to be talking about today has something to do with a field that I really don't have much to do with, which is medieval Europe, in the area of what is now Poland, but back then, we're talking 13th, 14th century, was for the most part the Duchy of Silesia, an area that has gone back and forth in history between Poland and modern Germany. Now actually when they asked me to speak on something, I said, well, what should I speak on? And they said, well, what are you teaching now? And since this is a lunch meeting, and the only thing I'm teaching this semester has to do with horrifically gruesome episodes in modern history, I figured that wouldn't be good for the digestion. So someone reminded me of a presentation that the young lady to my left, Eva Barczyk, the director of the libraries at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and also Mrs. Me, a presentation that we did a few years ago having to do with something that we got engaged in quite by accident, but with something of a lighter touch. And so I figured that that would be appropriate, and also it has pictures that we can show that are visually attractive. So anyway, how Eva and I became middle-aged couriers. How Polish medieval manuscripts turned up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, of all places, and how they got back to Poland. Let me see. This one? No.
on the bottom right, there are some arrow keys.
Yeah.
It also looks like there's something in there.
No.
No, that's
No.
not.
Arrow keys. These.
Click the mouse button first,
Yeah.
then use the arrow keys.
I'm not very good at this. Which one's
It
it?
is these.
Okay, all right, okay. That's a good start, isn't it? Class dismissed. This began in 2006, early in 2006. It actually begins a little earlier than that, but since this is all about me, my part in this and Eva's part in it begins early in 2006, and it involves these three people. And in 2006, you have from left to right, Timothy Carey, who at the time was the archivist for the Catholic Archdiocese of Milwaukee. You see here Eva, who was the interim director of the library at the time. And by the way, Eva, if you feel like chiming in at any point, if I'm forgetting something, please feel free to do so. And there's a somewhat younger version of me with a little more hair. And what we are doing is examining, well, it says right here, we are examining one of the manuscripts that they, meaning we three, helped return to Poland. Now, how did this happen? Well, it began, in a sense, in 2003, when Tim, archivist for the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, received an inquiry from a local resident, a man named Philip Gavin, who lived in nearby town called Racine in Milwaukee, and said he had something, a collection of stuff, that he wasn't exactly sure what it was, but he wanted to give it to the Archdiocese of Milwaukee because he suspected that they were items of historical interest. He had no idea what they were. Would the Archdiocese help them out? And so this began a correspondence that Tim had with archivists in, well, eventually went to a city that has an interesting history. This is how it looked, several hundred years ago. It was known by various names. Vratislav was its Latin name. It currently goes by the Polish name of Wrocław. And throughout most of its history, it was a German-speaking city associated with what is now southeastern Germany, that was called for many centuries Breslau, modern Polish Wrocław. And it's one of those cities. It's one of those cities that you have in Central Europe. Well, it's kind of hard to classify. Students will ask me, well, is Vilnius, Vilna, whatever, is it a Polish city? Is it a Lithuanian city? Is it a Jewish city? And I'll say, I have no idea. You tell me, what time we're talking about. Same with Lviv, Lvov, Lemberg, there's other, Lvov, which may be changing names before we know it, once again. We shall see. But we could say that Wrocław, Breslau, was one of these exceedingly interesting Central European cities that, from time to time, it would belong to the Dukes of Silesia, or of Saxony, or of this or that German, or this or that Polish, or Bohemian lord. And this was its fate pretty much up until modern history. As a matter of fact, it was the subject of a book not that long ago that was co-authored by Norman Davies. It's called A European City, simply trying to emphasize the sort of checkered back and forth, hard to classify history of this place. This is a map that kind of shows the setting of Breslau, Wrocław, and the fact that it shows the name of the city and the surrounding towns both in German and in Polish is, again, sort of indicative of the mixed ethnic and historical character of the place. Now, in a more genuine sense, the story that I'm talking about doesn't begin in 2006 or in 2003 when Tim Carey got the inquiry from Mr. Gavin, but it begins in the Second World War, the end of the Eastern Front in 1945. And one needs to remember that at that time, Breslau, current Wrocław, was part of the Third Reich. And in the winter and spring of 1945, the Eastern Front was coming to a climax, and the Soviet Red Army had completed marching through Polish territories and was entering into areas that were part of the Reich proper at that time, including Breslau. It bore down on Breslau, and it was in Breslau that Hitler said, we're going to make a stand here. We're not going to withdraw. we're going to fight to hold on to Breslau as long as we can. And it was to become Festung Breslau, Fortress Breslau. And so the Germans dug in, and the Soviet, the Red Army surrounded it. You can see the arrows, just as in the Middle Ages. And then you had the Siege of Breslau. It was an extremely brutal and bloody affair, and it lasted for 3 months, beginning in February 1945, right up into the early days of May. Breslau fell to the Soviets on May the 6th, and the war was over on May the 8th. So it was one of the last holdouts. Now, as you know, the Red Army was not too, shall we say, cautious when it came to taking German cities. And the Battle of Breslau left the city a shell of itself. What you see here is a map that tries to indicate the damage done to Breslau during the siege. The redder things are, the more it was destroyed. And what you see here, this sort of bright red or purple, is the heart of the city that was virtually entirely destroyed. It was bombarded. Then the Red Army came in. There was street-to-street fighting, the same sort of scenario that was played out innumerable times on the Eastern Front. And this gives you kind of an idea of what the place looked like by the end of the war. And so more shots of Breslau. And in a sense, Breslau suffered the fate of most of the great cities of Central and Eastern Europe in 1945. It's hard sometimes to remember, and increasingly hard to get across to American students nowadays, 70 years after the war, just how thoroughly destroyed Central and Eastern Europe were. Breslau, of course, did not remain German. It was part of the transformation of boundaries that occurred in Central Europe at the end of the war, and many of you will know that, in effect, as a result of Soviet actions here and diplomatic decisions undertaken during the war, Poland was, in effect, moved west by a couple of hundred miles. The Soviets took what had been Eastern Poland. Of course, the new Poland became the Polish People's Republic, part of the new zone of communist states sponsored by the Soviet Union and incorporated into what was, in effect, the Soviet Imperium for about half a century. Now, as most of you probably know, in compensation for the loss of these historically Polish territories in the east, the PRL, the New Poland, was given lands formerly German that had belonged to Germany, well, depending on when you're counting. Some of these areas had arguably been Polish at one time or another in their history, but for the most part, these areas, the recovered territories was the phrase that the Poles used to describe them. They were German territories, detached from Germany. The primarily German inhabitants either fled, fled from the advance of the Red Army. Those who remained were largely ethnically cleansed between 1945 and 1947, and this area was resettled with Polish or Ukrainians who were moved from these areas into the recovered territories. And you hear lots of stories. My ear isn't good enough, but you still hear lots of stories of people in Western Poland who say, the language that you hear spoken there bears the distinct markings of the Polish that's spoken in Ukraine, around Lvov, or areas like that. And what had been Breslau became Polish Wrocław. And you see here a map, you know, you get what you can get off of the internet, right? It's not a very great map, but it shows the reconstruction of the bombed out city and the growth of Wrocław into, oh, at one time it was the fourth largest city in modern Poland. I don't know if it still holds that, but it's still the primary city of Lower Silesia, in the southwest of the country. The old town. Back to the story. What does this have to do with anything? What does the destruction and then the rebirth of Breslau into Polish Wrocław have to do with anything? Well, again, going back to the story I was talking about, the inquiry that Tim Carey had gotten. Remember, he was the archivist for the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. He had been presented with these mysterious papers from Philip Gavin. And he was just, what had happened was, he had opened a correspondence with archivists in Poland, but there was a language barrier. Tim didn't know Polish. The archivist in Poland didn't know English, so it was one of those things, you know. But Tim was going to leave his post. He was going to take another job. He was going to leave the Archdiocese, and this was bugging him, right? He wanted to get this settled before he left. So, this is where I come in. The part that it becomes really interesting, of course. Out of the blue, in January 2006, I get an email from Tim explaining the situation. The Archdiocese had these documents. They had been given to them by Mr. Philip Gavin. They were certain that they belonged to some rightful owner in the general vicinity of Poland. They had begun a correspondence, but it had fallen apart. They were in need of a translator. Would I agree to serve as a go-between, as a translator for this? I said, okay, sure. Why not? Sounds like fun. So, you know, Tim gave me his correspondence, said, let's, you know, put it into Polish. Have a help me a lot, for Polish is better than mine. And we sent it off, you know, and tried to renew the correspondence with this archive in Poland. And we got a response. Now, what archive are we talking about? We are talking about the archive that in the day, before 1945, had been the Staatsarchiv Breslau. In other words, the official archive of Breslau. But now, of course, there was no Breslau. There was no Staatsarchiv Breslau because it had been blown to bits in 1945. But what did this have to do with these mysterious documents? Well, we have no idea for sure that this is what happened, but it's the only thing I can think of. And it makes all the sense in the world to me. The Germans were gearing up for the siege. They knew the Russians were coming. They began evacuating a lot of stuff and moving it out of Breslau for safekeeping. They evacuated supplies. They evacuated people. They evacuated this or that. We know that the Staatsarchiv Breslau began evacuating some of their documents, getting them out of Breslau, trying to get them to the west, into the interior of the Reich, where, you know, the Germans were still planning on holding out as much as possible. So, the way the story went, Philip Gavin's father, George Gavin, was an American GI. He belonged to the 347th Corps of Engineers, which landed in Europe, well, you know, in Normandy. They came in on D-Day, and gradually from 1944 until 1945, moved their way eastward through the continent. George Gavin was a sapper. He was a guy who built bridges and pontoons and things like that. And we know that by late April, early May 1945, in other words, the last days of the war, the 347th Corps of Engineers had arrived in Austria. Now, of course, in those days, there was no Austria. There was no separate Austria. Austria had been incorporated into Nazi Germany in 1938. It was a province of the German Reich. And the story that George Gavin told was that he came across some folders of strange-looking papers. Well, not really papers, because they weren't paper. He wouldn't have known what they were made of, but they were of vellum. In other words, sheepskin. It's sheepskin, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, sheepskin, thank you. I'm not a medievalist. I have to get a librarian to keep me honest on here. They were vellum, right? They were covered with mud. He found them in a ditch. He picked them up, wiped them off with water from his canteen, stuffed them in his jacket, took them home to the States as a souvenir of war. The only thing I can think of is that these documents from the Staatsarchiv must have been loaded onto a train to be taken into Austria. Misfortune happened to the train. Those things happened. It was bombed, it was strafed, it was whatever, kablooey. Stuff went everywhere, and George Gavin came upon these materials, and he took them back home. Well, by the time I got into this, we already knew pretty much what they were, because Tim had them verified by somebody who actually knew their stuff about this. Wanda Zemler-Czyżewski, Polish name, but she didn't know any Polish. If she did know Polish, they wouldn't have had to call me. But she is a medievalist at Marquette University, which is in Milwaukee, and she checked these out, and she said, oh yes, these are the real McCoy. These are genuine medieval documents. And she could also see that they bore the stamp of the Staatsarchiv Breslau. So if you're looking for a rightful owner of these materials from the pre-war archive in Breslau, best guess was the successor institution, the Archiwum Państwowe w Wrocławiu, the Staatsarchiv in Wrocław, the State Archive of Contemporary Poland. And this is where I came in. I sort of picked up the conversation here and said, look, we got these documents. We really think that they're from Wrocław. What should we do about this? And so by this point, I'm the go-between, right? There's the archive in Wrocław, and then there's Tim in the Archdiocesan archive, and they're sending stuff back and forth, and I'm sort of translating, okay, they're saying this, what do you want me to tell them, so on and so forth. And so this goes on, and so Tim says, all right, we have established that we want to give these the archive in Wrocław. So you tell them that, and let's figure out how to do this. I said, okay, we want to send these back to you, free. We don't want to charge anything like that. This is the wish of the family. This is the wish of the archdiocese. What do you want done? Probably you don't want us just to throw them in the mail, right? You tell us what you want. And so one day I get this email from, and it's addressed not to me, of course, because I'm just a translator, but to Tim Carey. And it's like, well, this is very, very important stuff. And in the name of the government of Poland, we would like to invite you, Mr. Carey, for a full expense-paid journey to Poland to bring these documents back. And I'm reading this. And I will admit, the devil inside me said, about the translator? Tim doesn't know any Polish. You know, this doesn't mean anything to him. And do I really need to translate this accurately? You know, would Tim really? But I did, you know. And but as it happened, you know, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go to Poland. I'm busy. Why don't you suggest that you go and say, okay, yeah, that's a good idea. So that's how we got involved in this. And we and Eva and I ended up being invited by the government of Poland to personally carry these precious, invaluable documents back to Poland for presentation to the Archdiocese in Wrocław. And, you know, okay, this is pretty cool. This is kind of interesting. We don't know anything about medieval manuscripts, but everybody's telling us that this is valuable stuff. So you see here Eva examining some of these. We had, before we left Milwaukee, we had an exhibition of this at the university library. And so now, what were these documents? Now, again, somebody had to tell me. I'm not a specialist in this. There were 17 documents in all, and you know they all fit literally in a folder like this. This is almost not this particular one, but this is what I carried, right? There were 17 documents, and to be honest, none of them is considered in and of itself, you know, fantabulously interesting. These are all kind of routine things having to do with real estate transactions and stuff like that. But to a medievalist, this is still catnip, right? The mere fact that you have them is amazing. And in fact, some of them stirred interest, not so much because of what the contents themselves had to do with, but what historical personalities were involved here. Now, I'm going to have to consult my notes here, sort of greatest hits of these documents. This is the oldest one. And this is a document that's signed by the Polish Prince Henry the Bearded, Henryk Brodaty, dated 1208. So we're going back a ways. Here we have a papal bull, or a letter, missing bottom corner here, and missing the seal that would have accompanied it. And this is a papal bull of Pope Gregory the Ninth, dated 1234. This is another papal bull, and this time you see the seal down here. This is a papal bull of Pope Alexander the Fourth, 1258. This one's kind of interesting, primarily for its decoration. This is, let me see, this is from 1282, and it signifies an agreement among Silesian church officials about tithing. Really interesting stuff, right? Well, maybe. But you know, one thing that's kind of interesting is you see these little linen covers that were used to sort of preserve the medals or seals that were affixed to the documents.
They were wax.
They were wax? Okay. Oh, okay. Now this is the one that actually got heart thumping in Poland. And this is the one that made news because this is a document issued by and signed by the man who would become one of the first noted kings of Poland, of Władysław the Short, or Władysław the Elbow High, or whatever you're going to call him, who was king of Poland from 1320 until, was it? Yeah, 1320 until 1333. This is not a royal document at the time. This was issued, he was the Duke of Kuyavia, and this is dated 1294. Here is another document. I don't even
bird's
remember.
nest?
Pardon?
Is that a bird's nest?
No, Eva, that's
Those
just
are-
the ribbons and...
Those are the silk threads upon which there had been a seal, a wax seal. Over the centuries, the seal broke off, and some of these have just frayed, and that's what's left. And they were kind of we rolled them up because we did the scanning of these before we gave them back. We rolled it up just so that it could be in the image, otherwise it was too long.
Frankly, I forgot who this is issued by. I think Shimon of Gaul, a name on everybody's lips. And the last one, it's actually the odd man out here because all the others are much earlier. This is actually from the late 15th century, 1491, I believe it is. So it's the latest document in the series. And it is issued by one of the princes of Silesia at this time. Well, our job, of course, was to carry these back. And, we wanted to make sure that we did this the right way. And one thing, I was worried, okay, this is after 9/11, of course, and we have to take it through security, and I'm carrying these documents, they're fragile and all of that. And, oh, what, are they going to take them from me? Are they going to, damage them in the security process? So I got a letter of introduction from the Archbishop of Milwaukee, Timothy Dolan, now the Cardinal Archbishop of New York City, saying that I was going on this vastly important historical mission, entrusted by the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. Please let me walk unhindered. This made me feel very important. The TSA people didn't care at all. Now, we kept getting indications as we went on that this was maybe a bigger deal than we thought. We got out of the airplane, we got our hand luggage, and I got the documents. I got them with me. I got them in a folder like this. I got it sort of stored under my seat, right? And, it's going to be a long flight. We're going to Poland. So what do? They give you free newspapers. I'm opening the International Herald Tribune, right? Because what else are you going to read on a transatlantic journey? And I get over here, and weirdly, I sort of nudge Eva and say, look at this. Medieval letters found. And there was a story talking about how these Polish medieval letters had been found, and they were being transported to Poland by this professor, by this couple of professors from Milwaukee. Very, very bizarre sort of, gee, better make sure I don't spill coffee or gravy on these. So it was actually with a little bit of relief that we landed in Warsaw the next day, and I was actually able to hand over these papers to the vice director of the National Archives at the time at Warsaw Airport. So they were out of our hands at least, and at this point it was not our show, we just had to show up and we had done our jobs. But again, this was treated as a very big deal in Poland for reasons I'll explain when I get there. We got to Warsaw and we were invited by the American ambassador, Victor Ashe, at the time. We've done a good job, congratulations, thank you. This is a great service to the United States and our friendship with Poland. This is Eva, and these are two of our kids who went along for the trip. Then from Warsaw, we made our way to Wrocław, where the official opening and exhibition of these documents was to be done. And they had a big show and a big ceremony and all of that. And you see Polish archival officials here sort of oohing and awing over these things. More oohing and awing and exhibitions and so on. Now, one very interesting thing that became clear to me only as we got into discussions with the Polish archivists was not only were they overjoyed to get these manuscripts back in and of themselves. You know, these are terrific things, they are priceless treasures, they are of enormous historical interest. But in these discussions, it also became clear that they were exceedingly gratified to be able to use this as a possible precedent for future cases. Maybe I don't have to tell you that the question of restitution or the rightful owners of materials of all sorts, properties, historical items, manuscripts, things like this, these are very contentious items in Europe to this day. You can get all sorts of plausibly legitimate claimants to various items. What they had here was a case of someone of his own free will saying, we want to give these back to present-day Poland, regarding present-day Poland as the rightful inheritor of the property, the intellectual property, of what had been the German Staatsarchiv Breslau. That's not a slam dunk conclusion in and of its face. But the fact that this was done, and that it was done for free, with no asking of reward or anything like that, well, I think you can understand why they would have considered this a very valuable item for the future. This is brought home all the more because they gave us a tour of another well-known library, the Ossolineum. It is generally known as, that presently has its headquarters in Wrocław, but has only had its headquarters in Wrocław since 1947, because again, it's one of these examples of a library, an archive, what have you, where there have been arguments about the rightful custody of it. You know, the Ossolineum was founded in the early 19th century in what was then the primarily Polish city of Lwów, even though there was at the time no Polish state. During the Second World War, the Ossolineum and Lwów were taken over numerous times. They were taken over by the Soviets in 1939, and the Ossolineum was declared nationalized, and all its materials became property of the Soviet state. Then the Germans came in 1941. They took Ukraine. They took Lwów, which is now Lemberg, of course. And they took the Ossolineum, and they nationalized it. And they took some of the materials of the Ossolineum and spread them out through various parts of what was to them the Reich. Some of them went to Krakow, which to them at that point was already a German city, having been brought into German-occupied Poland. Then, of course, you had the end of the war, you had the Soviet return, takeover of Lwów, the incorporation of those territories into Soviet Union, and then, practically speaking, a division of the materials of the Ossolineum. Some of them would stay in Lviv as part of, I forget exactly what our, do you know? Okay, yeah. And some of them would be moved to Wrocław, where they are now. So again, here you see, this is just one example of any number of cases where the contested legacy of the Second World War, and not simply materials having to do with the Second World War, but materials that would have a bearing on the history and heritage and legacy of the entire region, would be at issue. Well, again, this is becoming clear to us a bigger and bigger deal, all the more so when by September 1st, at this point, we're done with our official duties, right? At this point, we're just tourists. And we are sort of lollygagging about in Krakow, and we pick up the Gazeta Wyborcza, the most widely circulated newspaper in Poland, and we see this banner headline. And some of you might know Polish, or you can't, or you can make it out. And it says, King Wojciech, King Ladislav the Short, returns in a briefcase. This was like national news. This was like a banner headline in Gazeta Wyborcza. And we're kind of walking around going, gee, we had no idea it was going to be treated as, this big a deal. And again, this wasn't any special virtue of ours. I mean, we just sort of stumbled into this, right? It didn't have anything to do with our expertise or anything like that. Just that, you want to go on a free trip to Poland? Yeah, sure. We'll go. It was very noble of us. Now, but we kept getting reminders of this through the next few days. What else are you going to do when you're in southern Poland and you're killing off a trip? But you're going to go down to the mountains, right? You're going to go down to the mountains south of Krakow around Zakopane. And so at this point, we're hiking around. And that's actually our son. Traipsing in front of us. He's rather, at this point, he's kind of impatient with the whole thing and, just wants to hike and all of that. But Eva, why don't you tell the story of what happened on the mountain trail?
So
I don't mean to ambush
okay,
you.
yeah,
But,
no, well, so we're hiking up, kind of struggling up there. And there are others, there are other people around us. And there's some people, a group of three right in front of us, and we were talking among ourselves in English. And at some point, we come to a crossroads, and they turn around, and they start talking to us in English, and of course we switched over to Polish. And then, it turns out that coincidentally, they had lived in Milwaukee. Where are you from? They had lived in Milwaukee. He had been in Marquette. And of course, then we started doing all the, so-and-so, and, like, what are the chances of running into these people on the mountain path, that we have all these people in common. And when I said I belong to the Polish Women's Cultural Group, oh, I've been to those meetings, and I was active when I was in Milwaukee, it's like on and on and on. And then suddenly they look at us and say, we know who you are. You're the people who brought the documents back. We saw you on the national news on television, and we thank you. On behalf of Poland, we thank you. Again, we were taken aback that we didn't know we were on the national news or anything like that. The one little sidebar here for me was I hadn't told all my family that I was coming to Poland. I've got lots of family, and I kind of wanted, and I had the kids along, and too much family is difficult for them, so I didn't tell them. And I was like, oh, now they all know we're here.
But, it was too late to visit them, so that's a shame, isn't it? But we'll see them when we go to Poland in June. Well, anyway, this kind of brings us to the close. I could try to come up with some sort of pompous conclusion about the meaning of it all. I think it's an interesting episode. It was interesting for us as a personal experience, sort of drawn into an adventure that really, it wasn't an academic specialty of either of ours, but just to be drawn into this other world having to do with this topic that continues to reverberate. I mean, you can see it reflected in the newspapers, having to do with works of art, properties, what have you, about how do you justly settle leftover questions of ownership and property and custody from the most terrible of wars. And for us, it was an interesting little expedition. I hope I haven't taken too much of your time. If you have any questions, I'm sure that either of us, yes, Professor Alexander.
Do you happen to know Dan Politovsky?
Dan Politovsky, no.
He was on the music faculty here some years ago. He now lives in Greater Pittsburgh.
Okay.
But Polish background.
Mm-hmm.
And he once gave a talk to a group I belong to about some musical manuscripts. I have forgotten now might have been Bach, I don't really remember, Bach or Mozart anyway, that were considered quite valuable, but they had been tucked away in some obscure archive during the war to keep them safe and so on. And they'd kind of been forgotten about for years and years, and then somebody finally rediscovered them again.
This is
And
ringing
and they turned out
yeah.
to be, extremely valuable
Yeah.
and very rare, and people were just amazed that they reappeared after they'd been lost,
Yeah,
quote
yeah.
unquote.
I don't think anybody's gonna claim that just in terms of their intrinsic interest, these would be anywhere near on the same level. But simply the fact of their discovery and then the interesting circumstances of their return.
This kind of thing continues to happen. I mean, there actually are some documents that the Library of Congress has in their possession, and there's a dispute whether they belong to Poland, and is it Ukraine, or just one of the other countries in Poland. And the library, I mean, we kind of got drawn into that after this. They wanted us to intercede with the Library of Congress to declare that these are really Polish things. They were from the lands that had formerly been Polish. But the U.S. government is really reluctant to get in the middle of the political implications of this, since both countries are claiming ownership. And so, in the meantime, they languish at the Library of Congress. I mean, they're taken care of and all of that. But these
Sort of in
types
limbo,
of
yeah.
these kind of documents and artifacts continue to be found.
Our library has a lot of Polish materials, 16th, 17th century. So I work in the library, but I do not work in special collections, so I really don't know anything about this collection, really,
Yeah.
except that they are now available online, so you can find them, so that's good. But that would be a question for KU libraries,
Yeah.
you know, what to do with this. Is it? We know that they were, because I saw a couple of them, they have a stamp, Biblioteka Mianowskich or something like that, so. So that's a question.
Yeah.
That I don't, I'm not a librarian, I am a program assistant, so it's really not my domain, but I'm Polish, so.
Yeah.
And I am wondering, you know, how they got here, who brought them here, what the history of that collection is. I have no idea.
But the provenance
Yeah.
of some of these things is always very tricky.
Right.
And
And
we
I
just-
don't know.
My library just had something with Mexico. We discovered a 15th century 6-foot scroll, and it's like, oh my
Oh,
goodness, is this ours? Is it legitimately ours
Right.
or not?
Yes.
And luckily, through much research, we were able to find deeds of sale. Now, you could question, you know, did that person have the right to sell? But yeah, this comes up a lot.
In this case, of course, it was simply a matter of a man going through his father's effects and simply wanting to do what he thought was the right thing. You know, they must belong to somebody, you know.
And you had the Catholic Church.
Yes.
That was, you know, promoter of this exchange.
Yeah.
And so that was a big help, I'm sure.
And, you know, that's
Big
not an
factor.
illogical choice for the gentleman to have begun with, you know. They look like the sorts of things that a church archive might be interested in. I saw a hand over there.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk more about the actual verification process of
Okay.
documents.
Yes.
For instance, I assume these are in Latin.
Mostly in Latin. So a couple of them are in German.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I'm curious, and I guess how these remain hidden for so long, partially maybe because they're in an attic somewhere, but how they were verified, how many times they were verified, whether there was some concern about the authenticity once they got to Poland, that kind of thing.
By the time we got into the story, we were assured that the authentication had already been done. And as I say, this was carried out by this professor, medievalist, and theologian at Marquette. I have no way myself of verifying that it was correct.
There is one piece there, though. The archives in Wrocław
Yes.
did let us know, is that what you're gonna talk about?
Yes, but-
They did check their registers. They had very entries, the equivalent of a card catalog, but books of entries, and these had been declared missing after the war, when they went to check.
So, yeah, it checked out. But neither Evan nor I has any idea of how to go about authenticating these things. But, Professor Zemlya-Chigevska, this is among the things she does. So, yeah. maybe.
Including pinpointing to a particular year. I found that interesting in your presentation. You were able to say, this is from 1147 and this is from 1382.
In some of these cases, I think the dates are
Well, that was-
approximate.
Well, that was also
or-
Wrocław, the archives, they had the entries,
Ah.
and they had documented these, and when we got to Wrocław, they had already done one exhibit, and they were showing parallel documents, these were like mates to some of the other things they had, like the first part of the land transfer and stuff, and so then it was like 3 days later, we got there after arriving in Poland, they had taken these documents and had them on the display. And actually, some of the documents we scanned, but some we did not open because they had kind of dried out and vellum, closed, and I knew enough not to go and crack. So we just turned these in. By that point, Poland has wonderful conservators, outstanding conservators. So they had steamed and opened and already started some of the repairs, and I spent some time with some of the conservators. They were telling me to what they were going to be able to do with these documents to restore them to, where some of the writing has been watered out and stuff. So looking at the documents they had in their possession, which were in excellent shape, and they were going to do likewise to these, and that's where the dates and things came from them.
And at least in this one, they have it pinpointed to the precise day, not simply the year.
Some of them, a couple of the documents actually, had the date in the text that we could make out.
That's really exciting that they were sort of mated with other documents that had been part of a collection. Yeah.
And I think that was part of their joy, was now that it would be, complete.
Yeah, right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.